All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is the opportunity to learn a little bit more about what we've all been facing during the pandemic. So today we are being joined by Nasreen Khatri, Dr. Nasreen Khatri, who will be talking us through life interrupted. And I'm sure that we can all relate to that. So thank you so much for joining this webinar. A few housekeeping items before we get going. I did want to let you know that we are recording this webinar, and you will receive the recording in a follow-up email probably at the end of the day, and you'll always find it on our website too, so please feel free to share that with your community. We are encouraging questions, so please add your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll certainly take time to answer the questions that you've got. And if you're experiencing any technical issues, then please contact my colleague Pamela Sarianis at, I should say, psychologyfoundation.org, actually. So if you've got any technical issues, you know what? Why don't you just put it in the Q&A and I'll manage those. I'm here to help. So I wanted to share a little bit about who we are. So first of all, thanks for joining us. My name is Mandy Hickman, and I'm the Manager of Community Programs and Partnerships with the Psychology Foundation of Canada. And so our vision is really looking at a Canada where every child achieves their optimal mental health. And how we do this is through nurturing resilience through the use of psychological science. So we work with adults in children's lives to help to equip them with the kinds of resources to support young people and their mental well-being. Our programs are evidence-based. They've been delivered to thousands of kids across the country, and we've got thousands of community partners. And so we're happy that you're joining us today as you're part of our community. So on that note, I did want to get a chance to see, where are you joining us from? So if you wouldn't mind just letting us know across our country where you might be joining us and tuning in, give us a chance to see who is in the room, so to speak. And as we're talking about that, I can share a little bit more about what we've been up to recently with the Psychology Foundation of Canada. We have been busy converting our digital training into our training programs, Stress Lessons and Kids Have Stress Too, into a digital format. So I can talk a little bit more about that. But I did want to move along, and we can see that 53% are coming from the central region, and we have great representation from the Prairie region, West Coast, and Atlantic. So thanks everybody for joining us here today. Moving on, I wanted to share a little bit about the kinds of programs that we have. So I did mention Kids Have Stress Too and Stress Lessons. These are really stress management programs for kids from grades 1 all the way up to grade 12. This is where we teach adults how to recognize the signs and symptoms of stress in young people, and also to help to encourage the kinds of strategies, activities that can help to manage stress. We do have a fabulous attachment-based program called Make the Connection, and this is for babies from 0 to 3. So we work with parents and caregivers to help to develop that attachment that is really critical for young people throughout their lives. And finally, in the adult section, we have stress strategies, and this is a problem-solving program where adults can enter an issue that you might be facing, and this is a tool that helps you to identify what are some problem-solving methods that you can take to manage that kind of stress. And so finally, finally for me, I wanted to introduce you to our speaker today. So we're really grateful to have Dr. Nasreen Khatri join us again for this webinar. So you might remember that she had joined us just a few weeks ago to talk about loneliness and isolation. So if you haven't had a chance to see that webinar, I would really encourage you to take a look at that. But Dr. Khatri is a registered clinical psychologist, a gerontologist, neuroscientist, and educator with over 15 years of experience. And she's led the Mood and Related Disorders Clinic and founded the Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Service at Baycrest. In 2012, she joined the Rotman Research Institute with the University of Toronto, where she innovates treatments for depression and anxiety for older adults, including CBT, mindfulness, and exercise. And I'm pretty sure that we're going to be speaking about some of those areas today. Dr. Khatri's research has been funded continuously since 2006 and has been published in many academic journals and book chapters. She's completed over 400 presentations and many presentations recently, I understand. She serves as a mental health advisor with the Bell Let's Talk, Girls E-Mentorship, Women's Brain Health Initiative, Jane Goodall Foundation, and has been cited by CBC, CTV, Globe and Mail, the Wall Street Journal, and many other outlets. She was a member of the Board of Trustees with the Psychology Foundation of Canada up until 2018, and in 2013 was awarded the Women of Baycrest Innovators in Research Award, and in 2016 the Government of Ontario Leading Women Building Communities Award for the enormous amount of impact as a psychologist and gerontologist at Baycrest. So thank you very much, Dr. Khatri, for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Mandy, for that very nice introduction. Welcome everybody across the nation. It's wonderful to have you with us today. And I hope we can just start a conversation. As Mandy said, we're all feeling it. We're all feeling distress that comes with something so unprecedented, a pandemic of health, an economic pandemic, and a social one. So it's the social and mental health aspects that I'll be talking about today. And we've just decided to call it Life Interrupted. And even though that sounds kind of negative, it's really hopeful because life is interrupted, not canceled. And that is the message that we want to send today. So I'm going to be talking for about 25 minutes or so. And then we're going to turn it over to an extended Q&A that Mandy's going to help us moderate so that we can really get to your questions. I'm happy to share the information I have, but I'm more interested in answering the questions that you feel that you need help with. So let's get started. If we can just go to the next slide. So today we're going to be trying to learn a few different things. The first is to really name and acknowledge pandemic emotions, which are no different than other emotions, but may actually be quite magnified now, especially for young people. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. We're going to talk about when mood becomes a disorder. So in other words, what are signs to watch for in ourselves, in our children, in students, and other people that we know and love when it comes to deciding when to seek help. And then finally, tips for dealing with missed milestones and staying motivated during the pandemic for all of us, but especially for the younger people. Okay, let's move on. So what are some of the emotions that we may be experiencing? Sadness, anger, loss, I'm going to return to that, grief or anticipatory grief, frustration, anxiety. I mean, we know that 1 in 5 individuals in Canada are experiencing a mental illness. So that doesn't go away when there's a pandemic. So mental health issues are often exacerbated in times like this for children, adolescents, and for adults. I would like to focus on the idea of grief and anticipatory grief. So one of the questions I get asked most often is how to deal with missed milestones, whether it's a grade 8 graduation, a grade 12 graduation, starting university, summer jobs, summer camps, things that young people are looking forward to. And so we have a word for that actually, and that is anticipatory. So it's grief for things that you haven't even missed yet. So feeling a loss over something you know you will miss, like starting university, like having a graduation or birthday or a celebration that's a milestone event for you and your family. And that's natural. I think one of the main things we need to be in this time to get through this together is honest. So there's nobody who hasn't struggled with some of these emotions or struggling with them even now and today and going into the future. And I think that there's sort of a few different reasons for that. Another thing I get asked often is, what specifically about this is difficult for children? So we know as adults what we're finding difficult and disruptive in our lives and anxiety provoking. But what are some of the things that we need to keep in mind with younger people? So one of the things is the fact that their brains aren't fully developed. So the human brain takes about 26 years to develop fully. But what develops in the last few years of that time is actually the frontal lobes, which are kind of behind the forehead. And they're bilateral on both sides of the brain. And what do? They are the part of the brain that is the self that we usually think of ourselves as adults, like the me you know yourself to be. Personality, the ability to plan, the ability to understand consequences of your actions, and the ability essentially to look ahead. So why is that so difficult for younger people? Because they, on a biological brain basis, aren't there yet. So, the way that we often say that children are in the moment more than adults are, well, there's actually a brain reason for that, because they're not becoming the planners that adults will become later. So why is that a problem? It's hard for them to stay motivated and think about something that's beyond a few days or a few months. So the uncertainty that's brought on by the pandemic is very impactful for children, because, telling them that, they'll be able to go to university in 2 years, not in 1 year, in terms of not having online classes, but actually moving to a campus or whatever they were going to do originally, is difficult for them to grasp. Not emotionally, they understand that well, it kind of hits you on a visceral level. So they feel the emotions that adults would feel, but cognitively, they're processing it in a different way, because it's just plain difficult for them to imagine life in 2 years. Now, we can say that as adults as well, because it's unprecedented what's happening and we're all thrown off. But nonetheless, we are kind of better suited to thinking about what we may do and putting plans in place. So we have to be mindful that children and adolescents are less likely to be able to do that. So what would be a tip then? How would we help them? One thing is to be able to kind of break it down into smaller time frames. So what are we doing today? What are we doing next week? And not always talking about the distant future, because in fact, they'll have a hard time with that. The second thing that we need, especially when we're younger, is structure. So the lack of structure that the pandemic has brought on, because children aren't in school in the traditional way, is difficult for them. So one tip there is, as much as possible, to sleep at the same time, wake up at the same time, have regular meals, and have activities to look forward to and to learn from on a daily basis. And as I say that, I know it's easier said than done. There's many two-parent families or one-parent families where every adult in the household is working. And traditionally, or pre-pandemic, the way we were able to manage all the adults in a family or living situation working is that the children were in childcare, either at home with a nanny or outsourced or at school. And so that's what makes that economically possible, but also literally, functionally, socially possible. So when that's not the situation, people really feel it. Kids can really feel it, that their parents are sort of overstretched, and adolescents may feel frustrated or thwarted because they're kind of caught in a limbo. They're trying to launch, they want to be independent, and we want to give them that independence, but we also need to keep them safe. So that can turn into discord in families, and maybe we'll talk about that more with the Q&A, and difficulty in terms of, as educators, keeping children interested and engaged, or keeping adolescents that way when you're only meeting them online. So I think that's kind of the important thing. And lastly, on that point, it's the lack of predictability. So we all need predictability, but as any of you who are parents or educators joining us today can attest to, we need it more the younger that we are. I mean, I remember when my son, who's 12 now, when he was little, he would literally want to have the same thing for breakfast, lunch, and dinner if I allowed it. And so that's just, we're creatures of habit. And part of our cognitive growth as our frontal lobes develop to the age of 26 is when we start to be more adventurous, from everything in terms of what we're willing to eat, to what we're willing to learn, to new skills that we can develop. But the younger we are, the more predictability we need. So that means keeping things predictable for children and adolescents as much as we can. So again, some of the daily structure needs to be there, and explaining to children as much as they can understand in an appropriate way what to expect in the coming days and weeks as much as we know it. And then with adolescents, obviously months ahead. And I mean, I think that the concern here is that we don't have the predictability that we would like, but nonetheless, we are the adults in the room, and we have to kind of provide that safety and umbrella for our students and children. So if we could move to the next slide. So one question that comes up over and over is, well, what's normal? So I think that's normal is a word we can just kind of retire, probably for the foreseeable future. And we want to talk about what's healthy and what's adaptable. As we say at the PFC, we are wanting children to grow up to be resilient and flexible. So adaptability is key, right? So, but what happens when you're thrown into a situation like this? So the first thing I want to say is whatever anyone is feeling, anyone who's joining us on the webinar, your children, your family members, your students, is adaptive for them to some extent. Emotions are neither negative nor positive. It's important to get true and genuine emotions out and to be able to express them. We don't need to be afraid of our emotions. There's nothing wrong with having negative emotions, which is not the same thing as having becoming unwell in terms of your mental health. So please keep in mind that mental health is a continuum. Let's say on the left-hand side would be sort of optimal mental health. There's no such thing as perfect mental health. And then on the right-hand side, as we kind of go across, there's mental disorders or feeling unwell. And so what we want to do is be aware of where we stand. So I'm going to choose to talk about depression and anxiety today. And the reason for that is because that accounts fully for 70 to 80% of all mental illness in society. So we know that both depression rates and anxiety rates are on the rise for children and adolescents for a number of reasons, but I'll just touch on some basic things, which is that we have a different structure in terms of the way we raise children. They tend to be busier. They tend to be in more activities. The world is more competitive. Social media has its pluses, but it also has its drawbacks when it comes to socio-emotional development of children and adolescents. And we can unpack that more later if people are interested. But essentially, the bottom line is, if you go to see your doctor, or if you see a mental health professional, or your student or your child or anyone who's, so let's focus on children and adolescents, what are they looking for? So clinical depression is not the same thing as having a low mood or being stressed about the pandemic. That's natural and somewhat adaptive. What depression is, it's actually 3 baskets of symptoms together. So that means that there's the emotional symptoms. So depression means feeling low, feeling too angry all the time, feeling numb, not being able to feel, feeling chronically lonely. So something where your mood is not your usual self and not adaptive. The second one, or the second basket, is physical symptoms. So feeling that, so we're talking here about sleep, appetite, and energy. So feeling that you have to sleep all the time and still don't feel rested, or hypersomnia, feeling you can't sleep, insomnia. And then changes in appetite. So feeling that you could eat everything in the fridge, especially comfort and carbohydrate foods, to feeling that you couldn't eat a thing, even though you're sort of hungry, but you don't have the appetite. And then lastly, it's the energy. So feeling like you're walking through molasses, like everything is an effort. Or the other way around, feeling like you're driven by a motor. You have energy, but it's a kind of aversive energy. You feel you can't sit still, but not in a positive way. And then lastly, I'm going to focus on this quite a bit because this kind of lends itself to what I was saying earlier, which is what are the specific challenges that children and adolescents have. Everybody, no matter what their age is, also has cognitive symptoms or mental symptoms when they have depression. And that means that they have difficulty at paying attention, concentrating, making plans, using their social skills. And so these are all kind of higher order kind of mental functions that we have. But again, because children's brains and adolescents' brains aren't fully developed, they're somewhat compromised in that compared to an adult to begin with. And when they are, if and when they are feeling unwell because of depression or anxiety, you could expect that to be magnified. So again, clinical depression is a combination of 3 different baskets. One is emotional or mood, second is physical symptoms, and the third are cognitive symptoms. And if you've been having some or all of those symptoms for 2 or 3 weeks or more, it's time to see your doctor, to see a mental health professional, and get that checkup from the neck up to find out what's really going on. Because the good news is that depression and anxiety are eminently treatable, and I'll be talking about one of those treatments as we move on. In terms of anxiety, well, you know, who isn't anxious or more anxious than they were pre-pandemic? But we know that anxiety rates are going up in terms of children and adolescents as well. And when you combine that with missed milestones, disrupted activities, feeling that things are unpredictable and not having a sense of control, it doesn't help. So the difference between regular anxiety and clinical anxiety, probably this is the best example I can give, is if right now, where I am, a door shuts behind me very loudly, I would startle. So my heart rate will go up, my blood pressure will go up, and I may have some anxious thoughts that there's an intruder or something's broken or something just fell, or trying to figure out what that loud noise was. So all of my systems are kind of go. Now, if I was clinically anxious, it won't go away. Because I'm not clinically anxious, within a couple of minutes, I'll feel cognitively calmer. And within 5 to 10 minutes, my blood pressure and my heart rate will go back to baseline. So what happens when you're clinically anxious is you're too anxious even given what's going on. And so like a pot of water that's already 50% to boiling, it doesn't take much to boil over. If heat is a stressor, let's use that analogy. And when it boils, it takes a good long time to get back to room temperature. So what all mental disorders are is simply changes in the way you feel. So a distressed feeling, whether it's anxiety, anger, depression, loneliness, loss or grief, and then not being able to function or having disrupted functioning in 2 or more areas of life, like school, like work, like relationships. So that's kind of what those are in a nutshell. So if we could move to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of depression and anxiety. So fully 70% of mental health problems that adults have actually began in childhood and definitely by early adolescence. And I think that one of the ways that we treat mental health problems often is as though if they happen once, we'll get treatment, they won't happen again. But it's more helpful to think of depression and anxiety more like diabetes than like a broken ankle. So like diabetes, it's something that's more systemic. It really waxes and wanes through life. And it's exacerbated by stress, and it affects a lot of things like your physical health, your immune system, all of these kinds of things. So it's important to be aware and to not set expectations that if you or someone you know is struggling, it's important to have good self-management programs where you can learn yourself how to manage your mood and your anxiety over time. And the next slide. And we also know that when people don't get their depression treated, it becomes very burdensome. And in fact, it's set to become, I think, if it isn't already, the most burdensome disease in the world in terms of the World Health Organization. So that means years of functioning days lost to this, which is more than cancer and heart disease combined already. So it's important for us to be able to do something to get help and to help ourselves. And on the other end of the spectrum, which is what I study, is that when older adults have untreated depression in midlife or beyond, they're actually twice as likely to develop dementia later in life than people who don't have that untreated history of depression or anxiety in midlife. And so saving your mental health in childhood, in adolescence, and in early to mid adulthood is saving your mental health today, but it's helping to save your brain tomorrow. Because as I said, depression and anxiety are eminently treatable throughout the lifespan, but right now we know that dementia is incurable. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go back to the cognitive symptoms of depression. So we're talking about children and adolescents, going to just stay focused on that. So you can expect that if they're struggling with their mental health in terms of depression, that they're going to have problems thinking, concentrating, or making decisions. They may even have recurrent thoughts of death. So actually, this negative bias and the feeling of guilt, or that you're not measuring up, all of these kinds of things are actually part of the cognitive dysfunction. So as is suicidality. And then there's inattention or the executive functioning. So the important thing here is to slow things down, to make them more routine, to lower expectations, to have less on your plate, and to do things in a more systematic way. So to have, you know, a book where you have your daily schedule, like a journal, writing down things that you did accomplish that day, having lists, not in a way that overwhelms us, but in a way that helps us to feel a sense of control, a feel of structure, a feel of mastery, writing down positive things, so a sense of gratitude and pleasure, and also giving us a sense of predictability as we look back. So this kind of journaling or keeping an agenda is something that can be really helpful. Next slide. And the other one is executive control. So again, as I was talking about the higher level processes that haven't fully developed in children and adolescents. So that means that when people are kind of off track a little bit, feeling on the one hand bored and listless with this sort of very fluid situation that we're in, and on the other hand, overwhelmed by having to learn a different way. So we all learn differently. And so if somebody has to learn now using a screen on an online device, maybe that's not something that works for them because they're a tactile learner, because they like to move around and they're kinesthetic when they're learning. And so, you know, for the educators in the audience, it's a challenge, but also for parents, because not every parent is a natural born teacher, and that's not necessarily something that they feel confident about or are skilled in. So I like to take the more general approach, the more mental health and sort of wellness approach than the teaching approach, because we're not all going to get you know, teaching certificates overnight and be able to teach our children at home. And so we all need to kind of use our patience and just lower our expectations. You know, it is going to be okay in the end, but right now I think feeling that we're in the woods of this pandemic makes us feel like we are falling behind or our children are falling behind. But the reality is that it's a global pandemic. It's the one time in history probably that almost everybody's going through the same thing with much less resources in terms of health, economic, and educationally than we do in Canada. And so I think we just need to kind of remind each other of that, to be able to stay calm and grounded. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the cognitive model of depression and then just move straight to kind of tips and things so that make sure that we have time. You'll be sent focus on the highlights. I just want you to know that there's such a thing, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the cognitive model of depression. So it means that, you know, people have this underlying kind of schema or knowledge network that they develop through time. So partly biology, partly genetics, partly early life experience, partly, you know, um, biological, which is that they're more prone to thinking in a negative way under stress, and eventually that can lead to depression. So if we can move on. And I'm going to just skip this. We can come to that later if we need to. And so the gold standard treatment for depression, anxiety across the lifespan today in the world is cognitive behavior therapy, which is an evidence-based researched talk therapy. It's short-term, limited, it's structured. It usually lasts 15 to 20 weeks in online sessions, individual sessions, group sessions, and it really focuses on the relationship between mood, thoughts, and behaviors. So, the bottom line is people who are depressed or clinically anxious are not thinking the same way or as adaptively as people who are not clinically anxious or depressed. So it doesn't take negative thinking and turn it into positive thinking. It turns dysfunctional thinking and dysfunctional patterns of thinking into more functional and adaptive ones. So another way of saying this is it's a problem-solving therapy. So when people undergo or work with this collaborative treatment, what ends up happening is they learn to be their own therapist. So in studies that compare medication to 16 weeks of medication to 16 weeks of cognitive behavior therapy, I'll just call that CBT now. When the treatment ends, people who went through the CBT treatment are half as likely to relapse. Remember I said that depression can wax and wane? As people in the next year, as people who are on medication. So this is something where you learn to think and behave differently so that you can problem solve better going forward, and it helps keep you well so that you're having less episodes through time. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm just going to skip that. It's just talking about the evidence for it. So some of the CBT techniques, or all of them really, are things that we can use in our daily life. So as I was talking about, activity monitoring and scheduling, having a schedule, staying on track, having graded assignments, relaxation, social connection, and exercise. And so all of those things are techniques that we help our clients with. And so, but it's something that everyone can use. There's nothing about it that is specific to mental illness. As I said, we're all on a continuum. It's really more about wellness than it is about illness. Next slide, please. So let's now end off by talking about tips for coping. And I hope that today is just the start of a conversation about things that we already know and that we can use, not differently, but apply to this situation. So talking to someone, it's really important to encourage and model talking about our emotions in a way that's appropriate to the situation we're in. So it's important to let children talk the way they want to talk, to let them own their emotions. I think that when we see our children in any kind of pain or psychological distress, we want to make it better. We want to problem solve it for them. But this is a situation that's much more open-ended. It's important for people, even daily, to be able to talk about the way they actually feel and to have those feelings acknowledged. And here, when I say someone, it doesn't have to be the most important relationship in your life. As long as you feel that you trust the person, it can be someone that you can talk to on the phone or FaceTime or email or text, who's a friend, a family member, someone who's a spiritual counselor, somebody who is a mental health professional, a doctor, a friend. It can be a lot of different people depending on what is going on. It's important to keep some kind of regular schedule. It's also important, studies show if you keep a journal or make a plan, it's really helpful. So, they say in business that what gets measured gets managed. But in fact, anything that gets noticed usually improves. So studies show that if you just write down your problem, it actually gives you a sense of perspective. It makes you feel more objective. And that's kind of partly what CBT is. We learn that a thought is a thought is not a fact. And we learn to be better detectives about our own thinking, which is called metacognition, being able to think about your thinking, which is a lot to ask of for most children and adults, sorry, most children and adolescents. And so we need to help them kind of build that cognitive scaffolding and meet them where they are, because I'm making these generalizations that all children and all adolescents are going to have their own strengths and their own challenges in terms of being able to organize their thinking and planning around what they need to do. It's important also to relax, to do something that's enjoyable. One of the main things that people talk about during this pandemic is that the very things that they would have used to cope in a crisis have been taken from them. Family celebrations, milestones, sports, entertainment, restaurants, cafes, all the things we all know about and are missing. But there's ways to experience culture. There's ways to experience healthy entertainment, even at home. It's also important to stay on track with sleep, diet, and exercise. For sleep, I'll say, even just, anything you can do to keep regular sleep. So just a schedule of generally sleeping at the same time, waking up at the same time will help you to cope as a family, as an organization, as anything. 1 in 2 of us is actually walking around sleep deprived on any given day. So that actually has more to do with this, with driving accidents or car accidents than anything else. And so it's important, it's vital to prioritize sleep. A lot of us would do better in life just by having a half hour more of sleep a night. So that's important. I think we also have a culture that's very driven, that kind of makes it sound like sleep is for losers or something. So I would like to see sleep become the new status symbol and be proud of trying to get more rest. Also, in terms of diet, there's lots of things I could say, but I would say this. What I do is when it's time to reach for a snack, I eat things that only have one ingredient, like, bananas just have bananas, apples just have apples, nuts just have nuts. So it's an easy kind of thing to keep in mind, to just keep those kinds of snacks on the table. And when that's the only thing around, people will eat them. And in terms of exercise, we know that exercise actually grows new cells in the brain. It's the only thing, not the only thing, but one of the main things that can do that. So even if it's light stretching, walking around the house, walking around outside with safe social distancing, do what you can, don't leave that out. And finally, I think it's important in an attitudinal level to change what we can, because I've been talking about sort of functional things, right? Like making journals, making plans, doing things. But one mental thing we can do is to lower our expectations. We are in an unprecedented situation. It is a crisis, and it's fluid, and it's open-ended, and it's anxiety provoking. And so it's important to lower our expectations about what we can really achieve. It's nice to pick up new hobbies. It's nice to spend this time in a, kind of a proactive way, but we don't need to say things like, I think this is the time I'm going to learn a new language. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, but that's the kind of pressure we don't really need right now. And also to practice gratitude. So this is something that I do with my own son. I do it myself, and I find it to be very helpful, is to write down 3 things at the end of the day about that day. So not just sort of things in general, like we have food on the table, and 3 sort of different things specific to that day that you're grateful for. And being in Canada, being in the society that we're in, we have a lot to be grateful for. So I think that helps us to stay grounded and kind of keep energy. And I'll say finally, the important thing about I think today and these meetings that we're having, these webinars, is to really be kind of stay positive. And so, you know, I used to think of myself as an optimist, but I think I'm a hopist, because an optimist is somebody who does something because they think that that thing will turn out well. But somebody who's a hopist is somebody who does something because they think it's worthwhile no matter how it turns out. So I think, you know, I wish you well, and I hope all of you stay safe. And thanks so much for taking the time to listen to me today. And I think we'll turn it over to Mandy and look at some Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khatri. I've learned so much. You know, in particular, I wanted to really advocate for sleep as a status symbol. I'm into that for sure. I do think that, you know, people are really connected to this sort of the cult of busyness, and I see that in my loved ones and my friends, and I really want to encourage sleep. So thanks for underlining that for us. Yeah. We do have a lot of questions coming in, so it's great that we've really generated some good thinking. So we'll start with Anne has a question as far as the transition back to a somewhat normal life. How will this transition be for our kids, and what should we anticipate, and how can I prepare for my kids?
Yeah, because we don't know what that's going to look like, I would suggest not focusing on that, because I think it's good to have dreams and plans and say that one day we will, you know, take that trip and we'll do this and we'll do that. But I think more and more try and get your children or students to be able to not maybe live in the moment, but live in the week, because the reality is we just don't know what that world is going to look like. And I think that if we set up expectations, it makes it tougher on the authority figures who are, or whoever's setting up that expectation. So in a way, it's good if you can discuss it, talk about the way people would like it to be. Here's what I would do in terms of well-being, and this is what I actually do, is, you know, people feel that they've lost a lot through this, but we could be gaining something else. Because even though this isn't leisure land and people are busy with what they're contending with now, there are quiet moments, more than there were before. And I think that we can use that time to reflect on the way we want things to be next. So partly, I guess what I'm saying is we're going to have to shape our own future together. But I think the question was more concrete, as in how do I prepare my child for launching or for the kind of world they're getting into. I think we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves because we don't know what that will be. It's more important to build resilience about how to function the way things are now.
Okay, thank you. We've had a few questions in relation to talking to youth about their feelings. So do you have any tips on how to engage youth on how they might be feeling at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to ask them. And if they don't want to talk about it, how else can they express that the way that they're feeling? Can they talk to a friend? Who would they like to talk to? I think even asking for permission and saying, you know, I know this is tough for everyone, it's tough for me. Do you mind, or can I ask you a little bit about something about how you've been feeling or how things are going or how you feel about school? And I think when somebody does talk, we want to listen in a way that increases their talking. So listen so that others will talk. So what does that mean? It means just accepting whatever they say, even if it's stressful for us. Better to know than not to know. Second of all, it's important to reflect. Remember I said that lots of times, definitely younger children, but even adolescents don't have metacognition. They can't reflect so easily or immediately on their thinking. So we're there to do that for them. We are their frontal lobes, in a sense. And so when let's say when a child says something about their anxieties, worried that someone in the family is going to get sick, or they're never going to see their friends again, or something like that, instead of saying that's not going to happen, it's better to kind of support and acknowledge and validate their feelings, that it's tough, isn't it? It's really scary when you feel like you're not going to see Amy again, you know, if that's their best friend, during this time. Do you want to talk about it? What worries you most about that? So letting them kind of drive the conversation and reflecting what they're saying back to them, because again, they don't have that metacognition. So, you know, so you're saying that you're worried that you won't see Amy again. So remember how I started the whole conversation today with naming the emotions? Well, I mean, obviously we all know what these emotions are as adults, but it doesn't hurt to see that on a slide so that we ourselves are giving ourselves permission to feel those things. We can only take someone as far as we've gone, in a sense. So we need to be comfortable with our own emotions. I think, so that's part of it. And then finally, it's maybe or may not be appropriate to problem solve with them, but I think it's important to kind of listen, acknowledge, validate the feeling, paraphrase what they're saying back to them, reflect, and then see what the next step is. Maybe there is no next step. They just needed to, you know, to tell you and get a hug, or just tell you and then say, can you play a game with me? Or can you, I mean, you know, we can't obviously accommodate everything that children and adolescents want, but what is the underlying need that they're trying to get fulfillment of?
Okay, thanks for that, Dr. Khatri. We have some questions related to the transition back to school. So once we start to look at opening schools again, do you have any tips for educators that could help students feel safe and supported?
Yeah, I think one thing that stands out is, if we're talking about actually physically going back to school, it's to know what the rules are. Knowing what the parameters are makes it easier to follow. So I think if it were me, I wouldn't want to go back to school without knowing what's in place for my safety, what's in place for my psychological safety, what's in place for my physical safety and my health safety. What's going on? You know, I was out of school for what seems like an eternity. Now suddenly I'm back at school, but I know through the grapevine or through social media or through the news that things aren't okay, really, or they aren't back to normal. So now what? So I think we need to be straight with everybody and transparent and clear about what it is that we're doing to keep them safe. And also lower our expectations, frankly.
Right.
I think.
Okay, great. We've got a question that came in just ahead of the webinar as far as thinking again about youth mental health. And so just had a question as far as thinking about how this is affecting some teens. So the numbers of what stress is doing to youth is really alarming. So in fact, this individual is indicating that clinicians are reporting an increase in suicide attempts. Kids' help phone lines are up. What is it about the pandemic that seems to be so highly disturbing for youth?
For adolescents?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, is that they're feeling flooded by emotions that they can't cognitively handle. I mean, I think it's that combination, that they're growing up physically, they're growing up emotionally, and they're growing up cognitively, but that's not going to happen overnight. So it's really more than they can handle. That's one thing. I think it speaks to the level of distress that a lot of youth experience for a lot of different reasons. It's a time of great change and growth, but also a time of sort of unsteadiness. And so this kind of situation is leading to that, sort of increasing that sense that there isn't sort of a solid foundation, that things are in flux. So it's very anxiety provoking. Because if you can think back to when you launched or you were growing up, you needed sort of the safe haven of school and family, or, you know, to kind of keep you steady as things were changing all around you. But now the world is changing too. And so, I mean, it's just a lot to take in.
Right. Yeah. And it strikes me that the types of coping skills that you've listed here and that we've talked about in the past, if the individual, if the adult is integrating these into their lives, then hopefully that'll be a good model for youth and children as well, to take on, recognizing that there is all this uncertainty. We're sort of swimming in this uncertain soup right now. And what can we do? What can we sort of hold on to? And this is where I really appreciate this list of coping tips that you've got here for us.
I mean, like adolescence is in and of itself kind of an experiential and existential pandemic anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think that not feeling that you have an anchor in terms of being able to take appropriate risks and learn and grow during the adolescent phase. I think the other part of it is that there's a lot of ambivalence. And I think that's what's the part of the problem, meaning that as a life stage, you're trying to launch in small and bigger ways, but you also are unsure of that too. So you feel a bit ambivalent. You want to be on your own, but then you kind of don't. And so if these things are happening in the middle of it and you're not able to see your friends, see your peers, and see people in person that you check in with, it's anxiety provoking.
Yeah, yeah. It sort of leads into this this next question where we have from somebody who's shared with us that they have been home alone and they're trying to manage the feeling of loneliness and struggling with the lack of physical closeness to others, but also becoming increasingly apprehensive to going out in public. So how to come to a more balanced way of thinking so that I can continue to support others.
Right. So I think I'm going to just make short work of it. But the thing with loneliness is that so many people were lonely before the pandemic happened. And so again, it's a magnifier. And what happens with loneliness, well, first of all, you're not alone. Unfortunately, that's the way you feel. But we're all in a situation, and let me kind of break that down for you. 1/3 of us live alone in Canada, the most likely living situation. The other thing about loneliness on a more sort of brain and physiological level is it drives up our cortisol, which is a stress hormone, which actually kills brain cells once it becomes chronic. And what that means is that it affects your immune system, it affects your metabolism, it affects your ability to sleep. And so what ends up happening, so let me just take the sleep example, is it's not just people who are living alone, though it can be people who are living alone, who will feel this way, because one of the psychological impacts of quarantine is that you feel that you're separated from the pack, so to speak. And as mammals, we are hardwired not to be alone, because in an evolutionary sense, it meant that you could be in danger if you were separated from the herd. So you are not in danger, but physically likely, but the feeling is that you are. And so what ends up happening is it's kind of the idea of sleeping with one eye open, because it's the body feels and the mind feels like it's actually under siege. This is compounded by the fact that when people go out, well, essentially we were being told not to go out, and now going out with things that make, with PPE and masks and gloves that make it less of a connective experience. So why I kind of gave that little mini lecture is to know that you're not alone. This is something we are all going through to some extent. And I think the tips for that is to stay connected any way you can, whether it's writing cards, writing letters, texting, FaceTiming, to really push yourself a little bit to stay connected in those ways, because it's important. And even for adults, we need to be reminded that even though this seems like it's been going on for a long time, in the end, it'll be over before you know it. And we're going to need to keep our skills sharp. We're going to need our friends there. We're going to need to keep our social engagement to stay well.
Okay, thank you for that. And I would just encourage people to take a look at your last webinar that you did with us on loneliness, because I think we went into a lot of detail in that webinar. We've got a question as far as supporting elders in our lives. So do you have any insights and appreciating your background on how to support our elderly parents who are isolated? Haven't seen a lot of information on this, says Muriel.
Yeah, I think it's really important to connect in the ways that we can. So even if you're not formally caregiving, let's say you're checking in on your father or mother who live on their own independently, but still you want to be there. So the same thing, using technology for the good. So Zoom, FaceTiming, calling, and sending gifts or cards or letters. Keep doing sort of drop-offs for food and groceries, anything like that that helps you stay connected. It's also nice to have a bit of a routine. So knowing that you're going to be calling your father in the morning, or you're going to be calling him in the evening, or whatever it is, gives everybody something to look forward to, and it gives some predictability in a situation that isn't very predictable. So I think that that's important, and it's also important to stay on track in terms of people's health. So even though you're not necessarily the health provider of an older person, if you're going for groceries, it's nice to check in and say, is there anything that I can get you? Playing online games, anything that makes sense in the situation. I think the important thing is not to pull away because you feel like you can't come up with the perfect idea that's going to make this person stay. Hearing from you is enough.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for one more, and I also want to recognize that we have quite a few questions, so we will do our very best to try to answer them even after the webinar is over. But this is a question in relation to children. There seems to be an observation that children might have an increased need for support and becoming more dependent on parents than previous to the pandemic.
Yeah.
Should parents be supporting this increased need of dependence, or should they move towards bringing their kids back to where they were previously located? And what is the priority, allowing dependence for emotional support or bringing kids back to the previous independence?
So I think this is really kind of down to the individual. I mean, I'm not a child psychologist, but I am a parent. And I think it's kind of a balancing act. It depends how distressed, but I will say as a clinical psychologist, it depends how distressed they are. So, maybe we're all regressing a little bit, but, so again, kind of lowering expectations, but supporting them and giving them the message that they're strong enough to deal with this. So we want to build resiliency and build confidence. So the message we're giving is, I'm always here and I know you can do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we have time for one more. So just as far as coming back a little bit full circle around those milestones and recognizing that young people are missing those milestones, in particular grade 8's canceled, graduation in June. Is there something that you might suggest that could be done, perhaps virtually, or some other way to recognize this particular milestone for young people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's lots of ways of doing this. I think that, the peer group can get together and have some kind of online experience. Perhaps educators will want to be involved. It depends what's appropriate and possible in the situation. Mm-hmm. Can the family celebrate? So I don't think we need to put things off. Mainly, so that's kind of my main suggestion, because right now we have to accept the world as is. I think just saying that one day we'll have a party. I mean, one day you will have a party in person, but I think that's not going to be good enough for somebody who's in grade 8. I think they want to do something in the moment. So, collaborating with them and saying, well, here's the things we could do. Which of these would you like to do? And giving them the satisfaction of having celebrated, and yourself, the satisfaction of having celebrated in some appropriate way now. I think the final thing I'll say is, none of us are alone in this. There's never been an experience that is so global. So without a shadow of a doubt, there'll be a time when all of their peers get together where they will have these celebrations, even though that's maybe not the answer they want to hear, because everybody's in on it. So it's not lost. Things, life is interrupted. It's not canceled.
Right.
There's different things we can do now to hold ourselves in good stead.
Right. And perhaps a real opportunity for creativity at this point.
Yes, definitely.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Khatri, and just wanted to say on behalf of the Psychology Foundation of Canada, we're very grateful that you could come and join us again and share some of your wisdom and your knowledge. So thank you, and we do hope that you will come and join us again in the future.
My pleasure, anytime.
And just on behalf of the Psychology Foundation of Canada, I wanted to thank all of you for your contributions and for sharing with us today. We will be back in touch, as I say. You will receive a copy of the recording, and we will continue the conversation. I also wanted to just mention that we are a charity, and if there's anything that you can do to provide some level of contribution, of course, we would be thankful for that. So thank you very much to everybody for joining us, and we will see you again next week. Bye-bye.